may be asking yourself why a robot marionette is appearing on a historic production about smugglers in Hastings. This production, like me, is a bare bones production. No money was available for anything. Costumes, a ragtag mismatch, are not supposed to accurately reflect the periods or characters involved. Where they do is entirely due to the efforts and expense of the actors involved, like me with my smuggler's costume. Ta-da! Likewise, scenery may occasionally look authentic, as with the internal scenery of The Mermaid, but they wouldn't have had electricity. This production is a mix of documentary, animation and recreations of events. None of it can be totally relied upon, but we have done our best to tell it like it is, or like it was, rather. With this in mind, we have often quoted prices in roughly modern values to give an indication of how much something cost or how much was made in profit or taxes. This is not a very accurate mechanism, but does provide at least a flavour of the costs involved. Can I do my song now?
No!
Get off, bastard. Bye.
Just living in Hastings with the wind and the rain. No food to eat, it just drives us insane. We needed more money for the women and kids. It's just so funny, we're stealing it from kings. When we started out smuggling, it was wool from the lamb. Then it was tea with a tax that's a scam. Now it's some booze from the French and the Dutch. We're all getting pissed 'cause we're drinking so much. We're jolly good smugglers in the town and about. We hide from the customs when we go out. If you're from Hastings, you're a smuggler supreme. Sometimes you're kindly, and others you're mean. The gin is so strong, we can't drink it all neat. But the women clean windows, and they come up a treat. The customs and excise men all want their fair share. The judges and parsons just drink it and swear. When we're not smuggling, we pirate a bit. And sometimes, quite rarely, we go out and fish. We thank the government for their unjustly ties. Without them, we'd have to stay home with our wives. We're jolly good smugglers in the town and about. We hide from the customs when we go out. If you're from Hastings, you're a smuggler supreme. Sometimes you're kindly, and others you're mean.
In 1740, Riding Officer Thomas Carswell and 15 dragoons and customs agents had discovered some tracks left by smugglers. They found about a ton of tea hidden in a barn nearby. They loaded it onto a wagon and then started the long trek back to the customs house in Hastings. The Hawkhurst Gang were outraged. They heard about the theft of their tea, and immediately about 30 of them were dispatched on horseback to retrieve it. In the ensuing fracas, Riding Officer Thomas Carswell was killed instantly. The dragoons were taken prisoner by the overwhelming force, but were later released by the smugglers.
It was Christmas Day, 1740. The bastard had stolen our tea. And we weren't going to let him go away with that, were we?
No, not bloody likely.
No. I remember it like it was yesterday.
It was yesterday.
I done for him, that bleeding officer.
We were all shooting. We don't know which one of us got him, do we?
It was definitely me.
Yeah, we paid for that tea fair and square.
That we did. We moved fast, getting all those horses, chasing all the way to Hastings. That'll teach them not to mess with the Hawkhurst Gang, won't it, boys?
I don't know about you, but have you seen that new customs officer, Jimmy?
I wouldn't mind accepting me for illegal goods. I've got plenty of them.
I'd give him the time of his life!
You'd eat him alive. I would.
I think the men should hide some of the stuff on their purse. They claim there's not enough room in their trousers. I told my Bert there's plenty of room down your trousers. Sadly.
Don't be fooled into thinking that smuggling is just another word for piracy. The smugglers described themselves as free traders because they paid for the goods that they smuggled. All they were resisting with every fibre of their being was the paying of unjust taxes. Raison d'être of the smugglers was to make a huge profit by undercutting the duty-paid goods. It was said that they could lose 2 out of 3 loads and still make a huge profit. The government was trying to recoup the costs of war through taxation, a very typical means to do that. The Georgians, whose era lasted between 1714 and 1837, had 7 major wars, including the American War of Independence, the Napoleonic Wars, the 7-Year War, which lasted 9 years. It just went on and on. To be reasonably fair, the taxes were mostly aimed at the rich, the very rich, and the aristocracy. The poor had little enough as it was, so they weren't the main targets. The seaside communities like Hastings ended up benefiting hugely from the smuggling. In one night, a Hastings labourer could make more from a smuggling run than he could for a week's work on a farm. So the attraction was really there. Most people profited from smuggling in Hastings. The money men, of course, who were always there behind the scenes, lurking, making their dosh. But also small crews of fishermen could make a run and make some decent money and pass it on to other members of the community. Not that everybody was working freely and willingly. There was intimidation, there was coercion, there was the making of threats, but we'll go into all of that a bit later on. The trouble with history, as one might mention, is there's so much of it. And of course, people disagree about what actually happened. So I'm going to give you an incredibly brief history of Hastings. We're going to start with Roman times. The Romans came to Britain. They stopped by around about, 2nd and 3rd centuries in Hastings. And in the Beauport Park area, they had allegedly one of the biggest ironworks in the Roman Empire. It can move forward a couple of 100 years now and to the point where the Hastings, or led by a man called Hastur, who was either of Saxon or Danish extraction, arrived in this area. They were defeated in 771 by King Offa in a battle, but they stayed here and they grew, and at that point in time Hastings was a fantastic trading port with a great harbour, and people just made lots and lots of money. There's a day which escapes me, somewhere in the 11th century, about 66 years in, the Normans decided to pop over and take over for good. The Normans came with their own ready-built castles and fortifications. They were very organised, and they saw England as a bit of a place where they could make some more money. Let's forget all the politics, because that gets very muddy in the process. And then things settled down for a bit. It didn't really affect Hastings. Hastings at that time was on the top of the White Rock, having a wonderful time. In the 10th century, they actually started, before the Normans arrived, they were starting drifting down into the Bourne Valley. Hastings was subject to a lot of storms, especially in the 13th century. And then we got the storm of 1287, which pretty much destroyed everything. And Hastings fell into a deep decline. In 1287, the storm destroyed Hastings Harbour. And that pretty much effectively finished Hastings as a trading post. Because if you haven't got a deep harbour which can take the bigger ships and protect them from the weather, then you're not really in the game.
Sofflo sopraștele Plișatul vinu farmo Kamakulon Shali sombave Puri of Amaru Kutikarame Manto Nadirko Adam Krishaladi Shamilamanu Shmela Puta Nanisha Sade Forie Eloquon Samirin Kote.
There were times in the past when the Hastings fishermen, who were the core of everything, revolted. Now, on these two occasions in the 13th century, they did it very successfully. On the first occasion, they threatened the then King John that if he didn't pay what they thought he owed them, they would form a pirate nation and just take the money where they could. Well, he obviously didn't like that, but he did pay up in the end. The second occasion, only a few years later, in 1217, was when Louis of France invaded England. They got all the way up the Thames. The Hastings fishermen again said, now, if you want us to help defend against him, you need to pay us what you owe us, otherwise we will join the French invasion force. Now, it's hard to get specific evidence for either of these events. However, I like them, and I think they're probably true. So there we are. That's history for you. Horsfield's History of Sussex relates that in 1544, a charter of Henry VIII, Hastings state was described as by the flux and reflux of the sea, and by the conflagrations of our enemies, not only of lands and tenement, but also of inhabitants, reduced to waste, destruction, and poverty. We obtain a further glimpse of its decay in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. The town was described as much decayed still. The traffic of merchants thither forsaken, the fishing by reason of the dangerous landing, but little used, the rich and wealthy men gone thence. Poor men would gladly do the like, if without offence to our laws they might be elsewhere received, whereby our people are likely to perish, and our said port likely to be subverted and to become desolate. They estimated a cost of £4,000 in the 16th century to rebuild a harbour. They then applied to Queen Elizabeth I for the money, which she didn't have to give them anyway. She was stretched on finances. But what she did offer them was a letter patent. That meant that she gave them permission to go to all the surrounding towns and cities and in her name ask for money, which they did. They didn't raise the £4,000. We don't know exactly how much they raised, but a lot of it was misused and disappeared into different people's pockets. So basically, that was another failed attempt. There have been shipbuilders in Hastings from time immemorial. Obviously, after the failure of the harbour, these ships had to be beach launched. There were different people making them, like the Breeds, a very famous Hastings name. Boat builders in Hastings ended up building boats both for the smugglers and for the customs, and obviously each one went to them and said, "We need a faster boat." "Righto," they said, and then the other side would come up, "We need a faster boat." So it must have been quite amusing. When the smugglers had their boats seized, of course, then they were put in a compound by the customs officers. But the smugglers had a very naughty habit of breaking into the compound and stealing their boats back, which obviously really cheesed off the customs community. So in the end they came up with a plan. When they got a boat, they would cut it in half, which obviously confounded the smugglers. But ironically, it ended up being of great use to the people who came to live on the America ground, because if you look back and you see images, they turned those half-built boats into accommodation. Wool was so favoured by the kings and queens of England that they really didn't want to let it out of the country, so they put exceedingly high taxes on it. And for 200 years they actually banned it completely from being exported to France. So in stepped the smugglers, always ready to lend a helping hand where it was needed. They were known as owlers because they used to travel at night. The trade was also enabled by corrupt officials, and because wool was such a big industry in this country, so they used to occasionally have fleets of boats that used to leave here and take the wool abroad and hide it, and a fleet of boats does not leave without people knowing about it. So there was a lot of coercion and bribery and corruption that went on in order to facilitate that. Even when these smugglers were caught, they often got away with it because the judges, the lawyers, the business people that were involved made sure that, with a bit of bribery or coercion, you can get what you want. By the late 17th century, they passed the Burying in Woolens Act. That meant that, regardless of any shroud you had, it had to be made of wool. So the bodies were covered in these woolen shrouds. And there was a £5 penalty to pay if you didn't bury the bodies in a woolen shroud. And the only way to really check was if you dug the bodies up. In the late 18th century, the Industrial Revolution started to happen, and part of that was the spinning jenny. We weren't very good at producing homemade goods and small crafting cottage industry goods, but we became rather good at producing them on an industrial scale. The Georgian era. The first thing you should know is that it probably shouldn't have happened. It ran from about 1714 to 1837, but the first new Georgian king, King George I, was from Germany, to be more precise, Hanover. And he didn't speak any English, and he spent very little time in England. The reason he became king, though, was to avoid having a Catholic king. In the Settlement Act of 1701, it was written that no Catholic, or even somebody married to a Catholic, could become king or queen. The whole of Parliament was now in a much stronger position due to Sir Robert Walpole, and we had what is now called a constitutional monarchy. This meant that the king had certain rights and powers, but in practice, not that many. He couldn't even declare war on anybody. I mean, a king without that power, eh? Just think about that, eh, Donald? The George I was actually about 50th in line of succession, so they really had to dig deep to find him. In any event, George II, very much like George I, didn't really speak any English or spend much time here, spent most of his time in Germany, which suited the government and parliament because it meant that they could carry on and do what they needed to do without any interference. Perfect. George III, known as Mad George, didn't really have much of an effect, although he was born in England and he did speak English. George IV spent most of his time eating and drinking, although he was strongly associated with Beau Brummel, that dandy of the Georgian age. They did fall out later, though. I don't know why. The Georgian age praised science, reason, and debate over everything, but they loved to indulge in luxury and spectacle too. Power remained male-dominated, but women quietly shaped culture through salons, fashion, literature, laying the early groundwork for feminism. The Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, was a leading Whig in his day, and that's where you have a strong connection to Hastings, because Hastings was growing mainly through tourism in the late 18th century. There were 7 big wars in the Georgian period, including the American War of Independence, the 7-Year War, which, as I mentioned before, lasted 9 years, and the Napoleonic Wars. The fact was that we had to pay for these wars, or the government had to pay for them. And the easiest way of paying for war was through taxation.
So the country goes to war, puts up all the taxes. They don't care about us residents, the poor old middle classes. Every day there's something new, another blooming cost. We need to print some money over property is lost. There's window tax and glass tax, brick tax and soap tax, candle tax for when it's black, gin tax, and that's a fact. We'll pay for tax and hat tax. Feels like an attack, a knife in the back. Ooh, it's daylight robbery, surreal mockery, that's what it is. So it's whittling tax to death. And if you're an army, it's still your final breath, and you'll die balmy. The only way to survive is hell. It's smuggled goods you can sell. Join the smugglers to make money, deprive the government, that's funny. Oh yes it is.
The thing is, if you've got very heavy taxes going on goods, there's going to be a cheaper way of getting hold of those goods. And so smuggling became such a big thing in Georgian times. It was probably the most intense period of smuggling that the country's ever known. Smuggling became a really big deal in Hastings because we were in a good strategic position for the continent. Not quite so obvious as Dover, although Dover and Deal in particular, Deal was a big smuggling area. To round up on the Georgian period, they were opinionated, status-conscious, intellectually alive, morally contradictory at best, and faintly unhinged beneath all that politeness.
That's all right, my dear. Breathe in and you'll feel so much better. Oh, you are awful, Fred. I know.
So, what is a smuggler? Essayist and poet Charles Lamb, who was a visitor to Hastings in 1832, wrote, "I like a smuggler. He robs nothing but the revenue. An abstraction I never greatly cared for. I could go out with them in their mackerel boats or less ostensible business with some satisfaction. A smuggler is not necessarily a thief. A smuggler pays for his goods, although he may borrow the horses from farmers. He may intimidate people into hiding the goods, although he will normally leave some form of payment afterwards. Tax avoidance has always been something that the general public are not exactly against, although it tends to be the rich that gain most. Support for the smugglers was therefore strong, although sometimes brought about through fear rather than admiration. Admiral Vernon sent the following report in 1721. There are said to be men in the town of Deal, not less than 200 able-bodied young men and seafaring people, who are known to have no visible means of support but by the infamous trade of smuggling. He could have written that about almost any town on the southeast coast of England. John Collier, who was the general surveyor, the riding officers. John Collier wrote letters. He was an inveterate letter writer, and his letters have survived in book form.
My name is John Collier. I was born in Eastbourne, and I became the town clerk in Hastings at the tender age of 20. I also had other jobs. I was the joint solicitor to the Cinque-Ports. I was looked after by the Duke of Newcastle in his appellant, and at the time he was very close to Sir Walpole, the Whig Prime Minister. My career was long and fruitful.
Hey ho, don't worry, nobody can win. No matter who you vote for, the government always gets in. Hey ho.
Oh, great slumbering nation, awake, set yourself free. Oh, smell the comforting bacon, taste the bromide tea, and give a little chip as I ladle on the silk. Promises are cheap. Let me bear your crosses, make me boss of bosses, then you go back to sleep.
It's time to speak a bit about the Pelhams. Thomas and Henry Pelham, brothers from an aristocratic family based in Lewes. They were the overriding power in Hastings politics at that time. Both Whigs, both allies to Sir Robert Walpole, decided what happened in the Hastings area. And of course Hastings was a rotten borough. That meant they gave 2 MPs to Parliament from a population of about 3,000 people, of whom probably 24 could vote. And that's at a time when cities like Manchester with 100,000, Leeds with 70,000 population, and Birmingham with 50,000. But none of those cities had 1 MP. So little old Hastings had 2, which is why they were called rotten boroughs, because they were aligned so that the political flavour of the day, in this case the Whigs, confirmed that they would run the government and believed in what they were doing. They had one weak part with regard to the Hastings Smugglers, though, which was that the smugglers could influence elections. Sometimes coming up towards an election, if they had a smuggler that was a senior smuggler that was going to be prosecuted, they approached the Pelhams and said, if you allow this to go ahead, we might influence the vote in the election to go against you in this next time. Now, I think they gave in on occasions to that, although there's no evidence they ever took money or bribes from the smugglers. And the same applies to their man. John Collier, as far as I can ascertain, was a caring and honest man. Both the Pelhams served terms as MPs in Hastings. As far as I can tell, only 1 term each, but it may have been to get some experience as MPs before, because both of them served as Prime Minister as well, had their own terms there. So they were very important people as far as the country was concerned, and John Collier was very lucky to have them as his benefactors. At the general election of 1734, when his kinsman Thomas Pelham was returned as a Whig MP for Hastings, and it appears from the following extract from a letter from Henry Pelham to the Duke, his brother, Thomas, written in view of the election, that Mr. Collier was even then considered powerful at Hastings. As to Mr. Collier, you can't do too much, for if I can judge that town, Hastings absolutely depends upon him, and perhaps, if he were cool, would leave you. I desire, therefore, that you will from me tell Sir Robert Walpole, if he has a mind to have 2 Whigs chosen at Hastings, he must provide handsomely for Collier. The use of the word cool seems at odds, but in those days it meant perhaps loyalty was conditional, or there wasn't a lot of political interest there. And certainly John Collier never looked to become an MP for Hastings, although he was mayor 5 times. It sounds that they recognised his potential and his ability to support the Whig cause. And whilst it sounds all terribly politically corrupt, in those days it was all seen as part of the game. I'm not sure that's completely disappeared either. I think corruption is perhaps even more hidden, and perhaps the abuse is greater now than it ever was then. John Banks. Described by an acquaintance as not only a schoolmaster, but willing to engage in anything, from smuggling to land surveying. He appealed In a 6-line poem, For Trees to be Planted Around the Cricket Ground in 1865. In later years, he staged an annual school event on the central cricket ground, such as the Siege of Gibraltar, the story of the Armada, using model ships. He was a very interesting man, and in the 1870s, he actually produced a talk on smuggling in Hastings, which later was converted into a small book, which I have a copy of. But it gives us a lovely insight into the times. His father was a blacksmith. They were involved in smuggling in the household. I'll talk more about that later. But it's really good to have somebody. We already have John Collier from the 18th century, who gave us a lot of information from the other side, if you like. But John Banks could talk about smuggling and the people who lived in the old town and what it was like.
My father, a blacksmith, secretly aided smugglers by being a lookout man, moving goods from the beach. Not always willingly. One night, other smugglers turned up at our house with some 80 tubs of brandy. One of the tubs was broken and stank of spirits, and we were able to hide it. We had many hiding places, including an oven, cupboards, and even under a piggery in the garden.
I was out last week, and that customs officer Jimmy stopped me. Here, Elsie, he says, all suspicious like. You putting on weight? No, I says. I'm bloody pregnant. He blushes, and he says, I'm sure you weren't this big last week. I says, you know a lot about pregnancy then, do you, Jimmy? I moved closer. Sorry. And I says, would you like to examine me, Jimmy? He blushes and runs off.
You are a one. I bet you had a keg of brandy between your legs.
I did! The problem was, a few days later, I saw Jimmy again. And I was all thin again. Well, a lot thinner. He looked at me again and said, you're not fat anymore. And he gets all tongue-tied and apologises. Lucky I had me pram and I said, she's in there. He bent over to have a look. And I said, don't go breathing your germs on my little Jemima, you filthy great hairy beast. So he buggers off again.
What was in the pram then?
Well, I had a bundle of tobacco wrapped in silks, like a baby.
Like a baby with a big beard. I better not get pregnant too soon, though.
Unlikely with Alf. When he's smuggling, he's too knackered for snuggling.
A light or lantern shown from cliff or beach by lookouts would indicate the area where goods most safely would be landed. A cargo of 80 tubs required 40 men who carried 2 each, slung over chest and back. Goods, depending on the size of the expedition, would be hidden locally in caves, barns, hidden cupboards, and even under a piggery in the old town. For local work, a smuggling labourer would be paid 5 shillings. Which was the equivalent to a week's work for a farm labourer. This meant that sometimes farmers would struggle to get labour, especially during busy smuggling runs. The farmers also struggled because their horses were used by smugglers, not always willingly, and they could arrive back at the farm completely exhausted after a night carrying goods here, there and everywhere. On top of all that, the smugglers may want to use the barns or stables to hide their goods in. Left the farmers in a particularly difficult situation. If they were discovered by customs, they could face charges, and what they were paid by the smugglers may not be up to what they were losing. Plus, they couldn't even find labour. It must have been a very difficult time for them. Unless, of course, the farmers were smugglers too, in which case they had a lot of facilities all ready to hand, including the labourers, the stables, the horses. I think if I had been a farmer, I know which way I'd have gone. For smaller loads, they would be distributed locally, but for the larger gangs, they could be shipped as far as London and many other main towns. This would be a hazardous journey, not only because of the difficulty of the terrain, but also you would need armed men to protect the shipment from both customs, soldiers, and even rival gangs of smugglers. In 1741 at Lydd, 2 officers were kidnapped by the smugglers that they were supposed to be pursuing. They were trussed up and taken to Boulogne-sur-Mer. The next night, they were returned and reunited with their horses, which, in the meantime, had been used to transport the smuggled goods. Often with the larger groups. One group would be set aside to transport to the beach, and the other land-based group would take the goods from the beach wherever they were going next. So from being apparently empty, a beach could be overrun by up to 200 men, who would swoop up the goods by hand, or horse, or carts, and disappear rapidly into the dark. A good team could land 500 tubs ashore in 20 minutes. It was a very smooth operation. Another danger for the smugglers, especially the local ones, were they would have to sneak around at night, and sometimes they wanted to scale the cliffs, so they would have ropes coming down and they would pull the kegs up by the ropes and they would climb themselves up the cliffs. This was a dangerous occupation, and sometimes there were accidents. Especially applied obviously to the Hastings area around Roquenor, which was a prime place for smuggled goods to be brought ashore. There were caves galore, there were secret tunnels, sometimes connecting some of the local pubs. It was certainly a place where a lot of illegal activity went on, and probably still does.
In the countryside, hedges, ditches, wide, and in wet seasons full of water are met with on every side. Mr. Rennie, an engineer who was surveying the Weald in 1802, with a thought of cutting a canal through it, found the countryside almost destitute of practicable roads, despite being close to the metropolis, London, and on the other hand so close to the coast. He found that the interior was relatively untravelled, except by bands of smugglers who kept the inhabitants in a state of constant terror. With these topographical conditions which favoured the smugglers, it made chasing them inland almost impossible. Often, the gangs were much larger in numbers than the customs officers, and they also had the advantage of knowing the lie of the land. Hastings, now a fashionable watering place, and second to none in the kingdom in this year of 1872, was in those days of the early 1800s, consisting mainly of what is now called the Old Town. That part lying between the East and West Hills, namely the High Street, All Saints Street, and the streets along by the shore as far as and including George Street. At that time, in the early 1800s, Hastings was not paved, drained, or lighted. Gutters ran along the middle of the streets, common channels for soapsuds, dishwater, and other dirty water. Hastings, in its smuggling days, had a great many old-fashioned houses. Some of these were very well adapted in their internal arrangements for the concealment of smuggled goods.
If you wake at midnight and hear a horse's feet, don't go drawing back the blind or looking in the street. Them that ask no questions isn't told a lie. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by. 5 and 20 ponies trotting through the dark. Brandy for the parson, while the gentlemen go by.
running round the woodland. If you chance to find little barrels roped and tarred, all full of brandy wine, don't you shout to come and look, nor use them for your play. Put the brishwood back again and they'll be gone next day.
If you see the stable door setting open wide, if you see a tired horse lying down inside, if your mother mends a coat cut about and tore, if the lining's wet and warm, don't you ask no more.
If you meet King George's men dressed in blue and red, you be careful what you say and mindful what is said. If they call you pretty maid and chuck you neath the chin, don't you tell where no one is, nor yet where no one's been.
Knocks and footsteps round the house, whistles after dark, you've no call for running out till the house dogs bark. Trustees here and pinchers here, and see how dumb they lie. They don't fret to follow when the gentlemen go by.
If you do as you've been told, likely there's a chance you'll be given a dainty doll all the way from France, with a cap of Valenciennes and a velvet hood, a present from the gentleman along, all being good.
5 and 20 ponies trotting through the dark, brandy for the parson, Becky for the clerk. Them that ask no questions isn't told a lie. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by.
I was never a smuggler in a real way. I never went to sea. I was only a longshoreman and helped to land cargoes and sometimes carried a bat for fear of an accident, as the Irishman said when he took his shillelagh to the fair. I never exactly got into what you call a regular fight, but was pretty often very near it. Many a time a few of us had led the blockade men a dance on the wrong road. If any of our mates were took, we never split on them. They were a true lot, not a rat among them. I was never ever took myself, but I had a narrow escape once. That was the only time I ever felt tempted to knock a fella's brains out. Thank God I didn't. Well, a party of us were running tubs under the East Cliff, and I was on the watch. All at once, a lieutenant and a lot of preventives jumped out of holes in the cliff where they had been watching us. I gave the signal and our chaps left the tubs and bolted over the hill and up the country with the preventives after them. The lieutenant, who was a plucky little chap, got out with a pistol and let fly at me. Lucky for me, that bullet had a billet somewhere else. It whistled past without hitting me. Here's in for it, says I to myself, life's dear. Anyhow, if it comes to my life or yours, why, I prefer to save my own. So before my man could draw another pistol, I ran at him quick and in a moment had him by the throat with my bat over his head, as I felt mortal savage just then. But when I looked down into his face, for he was but a boy compared with me, and I was one of the biggest men in Hastings, somehow I felt soft at once. He might have a mother. So had I. So dash it, I felt I couldn't hurt him for the life of me. He looked up quite calm-like. He was a brave chap, and only doing his duty. I snatched the other pistol from his belt and chucked it into the sea and says I, "Now, lad, I don't want to hurt a hair of your head,
nor I don't want a hair of my head to be hurt either. Now, if I let you go, will you wait till I get out of sight before you budge, and promise not to know me again if ever you see me?" He gasped out, for I held his windpipe tight like. "England expects." "Yes, my lad," says I, "and I expects too. So you had better be reasonable and say yes quietly." "Let me go and trust me," says he. So I lets him go and trusted him. And that way he got off, and so did I. Quick, you may be sure. Coming up in part 2, smuggling, more of it. Women smuggling, more of that too. The goods. How come tea was so powerful? Tea changed us, changed our nation, changed our habits, and also caused a war. It also caused a whole country to become addicted to opium. More in part 2. Gin, mother's ruin, but a lot of other people's ruin as well. Let's tell the story of that. Tobacco triggered the slave trade and created huge wealth for many countries and individuals. Then the Hawkhurst Gang, the meanest, nastiest gang that ever existed. All about them and their final road to destruction. It makes interesting listening and watching too. And then finally, why did the owner of the Mermaid climb up the chimney? It is estimated that only 5% of smugglers were ever prosecuted. Someone like young Jack, a police inspector, he carried out one night smuggling, which enabled him to get married. Others, though, were a very different breed. The brutal gangs were highly organised and showed no mercy, who terrorised the public and customs alike, who killed without a second thought and paraded around in numbers in public because there were so many of them. Nobody stood in their way. They fought pitched battles with customs officers and soldiers, often outnumbering them in the hundreds. But the geographical conditions and the speed in which the gangs worked meant that no organised defence could properly be brought against them. It was more potluck, or somebody had whispered something somewhere. Most people, though, were too frightened to say anything because the gangs took their vengeance, and their vengeance was final. The Hawkhurst Gang, one in particular in this area. All the women in the town would have played their part. They would have hidden various items around their person and in their prams and any conceivable place, and we'll come to that later too.
I told the customs man that my old man had been fishing all night. I didn't tell him that he got me some silk stockings.
Little buggers to catch, I believe.
Especially when I was wearing them.
Women involved in smuggling in Hastings and elsewhere had one really distinct advantage over the men, and that was that the customs officers were not allowed to search them. This meant they couldn't fumble in their underwear searching for bottles of gin or packets of tea. Oh no, they had to let them pass on their way.
As a riding officer, I am paid between £20 and £40 per year and forbidden to take fees or gratuities. I am also expected to buy, care for and accommodate my own horse, and to get any information as to any illicit practices and make seizures wherever I may. We're supposed to travel out in all weathers and tackle, often on our own, against bands of smugglers. Even when we get soldiers to go with us, we are nearly always heavily outnumbered. Many of my friends have died in this way, and many others have been seriously injured. Some have even started working with the smugglers. It's safer and much more profitable. Even if we get a smuggler to court, he often gets off. Bribery or intimidation of the officials means that we are often wasting our time. The area I cover can be up to 10 miles of coastline in all weathers.
By the beginning of the 18th century, the government knew that it was losing millions in revenue, so it appointed riding officers to watch the coast
Their duties included meeting and corresponding with other riding officers, either in person or by letter, and inquiring and learning if there were any smuggled goods upon the coast or even landed. By 1698, there was a realisation that the mounted revenue men were not up to the task. So the scope of the force, now called the Land Guard, was widened, and in Kent their numbers were initially increased to 50 and then later to 300. Roads and communications were so poor, I mean we call them roads, but some of them were just beaten up tracks, but they were so poor that troops could take days to arrive, never mind hours. In November 1781, a riding officer was refused assistance by the dragoons because they were based more than 5 miles from where he needed them. They claimed that they needed a specific order from the War Department to act on his behalf. This was not true, and it wasn't an uncommon situation. Obviously, the soldiers could well have been imperiled their lives if they'd acted, because they were nearly always outnumbered, so there was a disadvantage to them there. Anyway, it made the job of a riding officer even more difficult than it needed to be. In his annual report in 1783, Sir William Musgrave, the Commissioner of Customs and Excise, said that riding officers were of very little service, though a great burden to the revenue. In other words, very expensive force who didn't give much in return. Not their fault, I hasten to add.
It was almost impossible to catch a smuggler, and even when you did, almost impossible to prosecute them, especially as the people in authority were also corrupt and benefiting from smuggling. On the 5th of March 1737, the Bexhill skirmish is in the news, but it makes heroes out of the customs officers. In fact, they ran away when the smugglers attacked them.
I think of Hastings being so desolate and feel so alone. I don't feel that you care about me with all the time you spend in London at your chambers.
I replied, I'm sorry that you think Hastings so desolate a place, and you're often repeating it. Makes me imagine that you are unfortunate in being there. I do assure you that it is impossible for any person to have a greater love or inviolable respect for another than I have for you.
I like a nice cup of tea in the morning, just to start the day, you see. And at 11:30, my idea of heaven is a nice cup of tea. I like a nice cup of tea with my dinner, and a nice cup of tea with my tea. About this time of night, what goes down a tree, you're right, it's a nice cup of tea.
Ah, tea, the elixir of life. Tea in its various forms has a long and rich history, shifting from a medicinal beverage in ancient China to a social and fashionable drink in the Georgian period in England. Of all the products smuggled into England, the one that caused the biggest loss in revenue was tea. In 1784, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger noted more than 3,000 tons of tea was smuggled into Britain a year by the late 1700s, with just 2,000 tons imported legally. It was also the cause of mass-scale opium addiction and the loss of our biggest colony. We imported all the tea from China, but the Chinese weren't interested in bartering or trading with us, really. They wanted silver for tea because there was nothing that they felt they needed. This led to a huge imbalance of trade for Europe. Our workaround was to import massive amounts of opium from India. This led to widespread addiction. The Chinese government tried to ban opium in 1839, and officials seized and destroyed huge quantities of British opium. Britain responded with military force. England and China were involved in two major conflicts, known as the Opium Wars, from 1839 to 1842, 1856 to 1860, driven by Britain's desire to reverse trade imbalances and force open Chinese markets, specifically for selling opium from India. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was established. Modern Chinese foreign policy is less about expansion and more about preventing return to vulnerability. Local Hastings developer Patrick Robertson made his fortune taking part in the organisation which supplied the Chinese with opium. He later became an MP in Hastings and was elected on 2 occasions, failing to get elected on another 4. His first major development in Hastings was on the land previously known as the America Ground. For some 30 years, no gentleman was better known or more widely respected throughout the borough of Hastings than the subject of this notice. His hearty benevolence and genial nature made him the friend of all. Although constantly engaged in the forefront of political warfare, his personal qualities and kindly characteristics won the respect of his liberal opponents. It was in the Chinese trade that he became affluent. Between 30 and 40 years ago, he settled down at Hastings. It changed the habits of a nation. It was so expensive and exclusive that it was seen as a must-have by the rich. Tea ceremonies were invented to make the most of the occasion. It might be the only time when the lady of the house might actually serve the tea.
Oh, welcome to my humble abode. Oh, I'm supposed to talk to you about tea and how it has completely changed my life. Well, it has! The hoi polloi cannot afford or enjoy such heavenly taste. They do not have the right palate to appreciate the subtle and sophisticated flavouring. Myself and my ladies do enjoy having our finger sandwiches with cucumber, egg and cress, plus some delicious small cakes. But the best thing is making the tea, obviously. I keep it in a locked tea caddy because it's very expensive. My George... No, not the king, silly. He says it'll be the ruination of him. He says it works out at something like £300 per pot. But I think he's exaggerating. And I make it last by using the leaves at least 3 times. Then I give the waste to cook. I'm not quite sure what she does with it. But I have heard that some people dry them, then mix them. I think the word is adulterate. It's a bit naughty to me. With other leaves like willow and licorice. Anyway, it's such a wonderful ceremony, with me doing the serving. I ask you, me, a lady, doing the serving. I absolutely love it, and we chat for hours. My George thinks we're plotting against men, which I think is a wonderful idea. Couldn't do any worse. All very well buying from smugglers, but they're so uncouth, and they smell, although it is rather exciting. Oh, my ladies have arrived. I must go.
People often associate the American War of Independence with the Boston Tea Party and the cry of no taxation without representation, the huge taxes placed on tea sales. And it wasn't just the Americans being punished, we all were. The irony is that in 1773, the British government reduced the tax to a low of 12.5%. So they became cheaper than the smuggled tea. If anything, this annoyed the Americans even further. As in England, there were smugglers and businessmen who were making a lot of money out of smuggling. And it may have been that this led to the Boston Tea Party and disruption of the trade routes in America, because they were losing money. After the American War of Independence, America was smuggling goods to us anyway. Tobacco was the driver behind the slave trade in the 17th and 18th centuries. The slave triangle meant that ships would depart from ports in England, Portugal, who was the largest transporter of slaves, 4.5 million. The Netherlands, France, Denmark and Sweden. Over 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic, and it created huge wealth for the countries involved. Most tobacco came to England from the American colonies, especially Virginia and Maryland. And after independence, America continued to supply England with tobacco, even though the price increased. Again, it was something different and very expensive to the Georgians, so they took to it immediately. Both smoking and sniffing took off. The government was getting a huge amount from the tax, so they were happy. The Georgians would make art and satire out of anything, and tobacco immediately made its presence felt. It indicated both wealth and luxury to the observer. Snuff became extremely fashionable among the elite in the 18th century. Meanwhile, pipe smoking remained popular amongst the lower and middle classes, though it was socially frowned upon among the elite during early Georgian times. After 1800, tobacco replaced tea as the prime smuggled item. By 1820, the tobacco, which could be bought in Flushing, Belgium for 7p a pound, could be sold for 4 shillings a pound in England. Some individuals did suspect that tobacco could be harmful, especially due to coughing, nausea or dizziness it caused in some users. In 1863, William Gladstone, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, significantly reduced the cost of tobacco, which helped kill the smuggling. Gin was originally untaxed when it became popular in England. French brandy was taxed heavily due to ongoing tensions with France. The government encouraged the production of English spirits as a patriotic and economic move, supporting domestic grain markets and reducing imports. This led to mass consumption, especially among the poor. Gin was often homemade or sold in small shops and even street corners, with little regard for quality or safety. By the early 1700s, gin consumption had spiralled out of control, leading to widespread addiction, crime and public health issues. It became particularly popular among working class women, many of whom were struggling with poverty, hard labour and poor living conditions. The addiction led to widespread neglect of children too. Stories and propaganda circulated about infants dying from neglect, or even being poisoned by alcohol-laced breast milk. In the most extreme cases, desperate mothers were said to have sold their children to get more gin. These stories were often sensationalised, but had a powerful impact on public opinion. William Hogarth's famous 1751 engraving, Gin Lane, shows horrifying scenes. A drunken mother lets her baby fall to its death, while others suffer around her. The situation got so bad that it prompted a series of laws aimed at controlling the gin trade, such as the Gin Act of 1736, which introduced taxes and licences. In 18th century England, a smuggler's gin being over 70% overproof meant it was a very strong undiluted spirit with an extremely high alcoholic content. Old town women would often use it to clean their windows, and it was far more potent than typical drinks. The high alcohol levels in smuggled spirits were often reduced by adding water and colourings before retail, sometimes leading to deadly alcohol poisoning for consumers.
One morn when the wind from the northward blew keenly, when sullen roared the big waves on the main, a famed smuggler will watch kissed his Susan serenely, took helm and to sea boldly steered out again. Will had promised his Sue that this trip, if well ended.
So, I'm here specifically, as you know, to ask you for some history relating to the Mermaid with the Hawkhurst Gang of smugglers, the meanest, nastiest smugglers gang ever existed.
It's quite funny actually, because when I first started working here, the first stories we ever read about the hotel were about the smugglers sitting in the bar with their pistols on the table, and no one said anything against them, otherwise they were nailed alive to their front doors. Nailed alive by their ears, because obviously they heard too much information they shouldn't have done, so the only way they can get off the door is to actually cut their own ear off. So that's pretty gruesome. And we've got, we think, 6 ghosts, resident ghosts, and I've been here 42 years, so I'm still waiting for them to come out and say hello. But they're supposedly people who possibly sold tales out of turn and about the smuggling gangs, and hence they've come back to haunt us because they met their deaths in very, shall we say, possibly horrendous way, but we don't know for sure. The hotel itself, it was rebuilt in 1377, and when they rebuilt it, because it was originally built in 1156, so 900 years ago, when it was rebuilt, we reckon it was rebuilt with quite a few hidey holes in case, if it was ever burnt down, people would be prepared. So in the lounge, we've discovered a 9-foot drop at one end, which we think was to hide people. There's a large void between the reception area and the restaurant, which is 9 foot by 4 foot underneath. And one side's cut in slope, with the idea that you gently lower your barrels down without them smashing at the bottom. So the smugglers sort of came to an inn which was ready prepared to hide things. We've got priest hole up the chimney. I went up there once, came down black and covered in spiders, so I'm not doing that again. So they're quite clever, and secret passages supposedly leading from our bar down to the bell, and then we've just discovered another void which goes down the centre of the car park to the far wall. But again, we don't know where that goes until they come back and investigate more.
The Hawkhurst Gang was probably the most notorious and cruel of all of the smuggling gangs. Whilst the main gang might be an estimated 30 or 40 members, they could call on hundreds more if the job called for it, or if they were going to have a little battle with the customs people. So 200 was not an unheard of, it was a fairly common number, because 200 men could also move the contraband very fast from the beach through those raggedy old lanes up to London if necessary. And they could for the most part travel unmolested, because nobody was going to take on 30, 40 members of the Hawkhurst Gang. I mean, they'd have had to be complete idiots. So there was safety in numbers as well. Again, most local law enforcements, like the riding officers, judges and mayors, were in fear of them. So even when they caught some of them, they would probably get away with it through intimidation of the judges, magistrates, or through bribery. It were fairly common and widespread. And there might even be, if a judge resisted them, there may be a fire at his property, or he might be physically threatened, or his family.
What are you two sniggering about?
You know that load of tea we stole at Block's barn?
Yeah.
Well, we couldn't find it earlier, so we reckon that daft farmhand nicked it.
Right, still not getting it.
So we tried to, persuade him to tell us, see?
If you don't start telling me what's going on soon, I'm going to persuade you to into that bloody well over there.
Well, we beat him to within an inch of his life.
Then we beat him some more.
So you killed him, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Still not seeing the funny side.
Well, about an hour after we dumped his body, we found the tea.
Right where we left it.
So, you killed him for absolutely no reason?
Correct.
Well, that is funny!
Goudhurst still is a small village in Kent, and they lived in fear like all of the other people from the Hawkhurst Gang. But then William Sturt, a man born in Goudhurst, returned from his years and years of military service. I think his rank was something like a corporal. However, he'd learnt a lot. When he saw the parlous state of his old town and the fear that was engendered in the people, he decided he'd sort it out, and he did. He trained up the men, he formed a militia, he trained them in shooting, he trained them in strategy and tactics. And then eventually the Hawkhurst Gang heard about this, and they decided they were going to ride to Goudhurst and to burn the place to the ground as a lesson to others. So something like 15 or 20 heavily armed smugglers got on their horses and rode to Hawkhurst, where they were soundly whipped by the local militia, killing 5 to 10 of them outright, and the others just scattered for good. The next stage, in 1747, when the Hawkhurst Gang decided to seize the goods that had been taken off them in Poole Customs House. The contraband goods that they brought over to the country were seized, a whole mixture of tobacco and brandy, you name it, it was in there. They attacked the customs house and regained their goods, and as they were off on their merry way home, they rode to a village where a man called Daniel Teatr worked as a shoemaker. Now, one of the gang knew him, and they had a little happy hello, and Daniel was given a bit of tea by his old friend. After the attack on Poole Customs House, the government was enraged and decided to spend money to bring the Hawkhurst Gang to an end. They did hear about Daniel Teatr, so he was approached by the customs and said, will you make a deposition which will enable us to go and sort them out? And he agreed, I don't know under what conditions, but he and William Galley, who was a customs officer, set off to make the deposition. Unfortunately, on the first day, they were kidnapped by the Hawkhurst Gang and then spent a couple of days being mercilessly tortured and beaten. I won't even go into the ways, it was just beyond inhuman. Eventually, they thought Galley was killed, the customs officer, and they buried him. When he was later dug up, it was found that he hadn't actually been dead, but they buried him alive, and that had finally killed him. With Daniel Teatr, they tortured him for another few days and then threw him down a well. But when they heard him still moaning terribly, and he begged to be killed by them over a time, they threw stones and boulders down until the cries ceased. Members of the Hawkhurst Gang were tried in Chichester for the murders of Galley and Teatr. 6 of them were hanged, but 1 died the night before, so in all 7 died. A couple of months later, 2 more were hanged in Tyburn, and some of the bodies from these hangings were put in gibbets and exhibited around the county as a deterrent.
Oh, come list a while, and you shall hear, by the rolling sea lived a maiden fair. Her father had followed the smuggling trade, like a war hero that never was afraid. Now in sailor's clothing young Jane did go, dressed like a sailor from top to toe. Her aged father was the only care of this female smuggler who never did despair. With her pistols loaded she went abroad, and by her side hung a glittering sword. In her belt 2 daggers, well armed for war, was a female smuggler who never feared a star. Now they had not sailed far from the land when a strange broad brought them to a stand. These are sea robbers, the maid did cry, but the female smuggler will conquer or will die. Now they killed those pirates and took their store, and soon they returned to old England's shore. With a keg of brandy she walked along, did this female smuggler, and sweetly sang a song. Not far she travelled before she spied a commodore at the blockade. He said, surrender or you must fall. But the female smuggler said, But she was followed by the blockade, who in iron strong did put this fair maid. And when they brought her to trial to be tried, this young female smuggler stood dressed like a bride.
Read to the judge, and the jury said, my heart won't let me prosecute this maid. Pardon her, for on my knees I crave for this female smuggler, so valiant and so brave.
And this commodore to her father went to gain her hand. He asked his consent he gave. So the commodore and the female smuggler are joined forevermore.
In 1749, while the remains of the Hawkhurst Gang were being dealt with, there was a bit of excitement over in Hastings because, well, in January 1749, a ship ran aground. That ship was the Amsterdam, which we all know as more as the wreck of the Amsterdam, which you could still see at low tides in Bulverheim. John Collier's son-in-law, George Ward, tells next part of the story. I saw more than 1,000 people on the beach with their long poles and hooks, but the soldiers were there and kept order. 27 chests of money have been carried to the Hastings Customs house, and I believe that the rest of the cargo will be taken there as fast as it can be loaded. There was also an empty chest. Some say it was so before it came out of the ship. The ship, which set sail from Holland, would have been full of money for trade purposes, to buy the silks, the spices, the tea, everything like that. One man was shot on the beach, but the Hastings coroner, in his wisdom, and probably because he was a bit lazy, decided that he'd been shot at sea and therefore was not his responsibility to sort out. Now we come to the bit about the smuggling. Where is the connection? Well, because one of the chests of silver that was taken out was plundered by a smuggler called Anthony Watson. He and his gang boarded the stranded vessel and stole 50 silver ingots. Now, 34 of these were recovered, 16 were never found. And Anthony Watson was never seen again, although some of the men were arrested. Looting and corruptions were widespread, with soldiers, sailors and town people all implicated. Efforts to recover the cargo, including blowing up parts of the ship, during which the engineer who'd organised that was killed. Large quantities of provisions and wine were saved, though much treasure was lost or stolen. Also, several chests of wine in bottles, of which there is in the ship a great many thousand dozens. I have no idea what 1,000 dozen is. Well, I'm not sure they did, but anyway, that's what was written in the letter. If you would have any, please let me know. I fancy about 1 shilling a bottle will be the price. It is believed that up to 70% of the cargo still remains in the vessel.
The smugglers have got to an amazing height on the Sussex and Kentish coast that it has come for some time a very serious thing and highly worthy of the consideration of the Senate in regard to the vast quantity of goods clandestinely imported, the triumphant manner and the insults, menaces and abuses given not only to the officers of the revenue, but to any other persons. that offer to speak against their detestable practices. The magistrates fully decline to put in practice the laws against them. The audacious insolence of the smugglers, but in the present situation, and the menaces and insults I have received, I shall decline acting as solicitor in any prosecutions against the smugglers. I shall never cease to acknowledge the assistance I have had from you and my obligations to you, and give the utmost intelligence I can to the board and to the secretaries and all my assistants for the service of the revenue.
After the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in 1799, transforming the Republic into an empire, and then began a series of wars in Europe to gain more power and more riches for the French Empire. At the same time, in Hastings, it was growing as a popular destination. Seaside excursions for people, invalids, and the seaside air was considered to be a real boon to anybody suffering medical problems. Hastings was trying to sell itself as a sort of a polite place for genteel folk, especially with a little bit of character, which obviously tourists do like a little bit of character, like the Old Town would have been right up their street. In particular, for nerves, lungs and melancholy, a very Georgian concern. Georgian society was totally obsessed over manners, etiquette and appearances. Being well-spoken and well-dressed mattered.
Even Karl Marx recommended it. When Friedrich Engels went to New Brighton to recuperate, failed and then thought about the Isle of Man, Karl Marx wrote to him, "Why not go to Hastings, which is famed for its efficacy in cases like yours? It's the only specific watering hole of the kind in England. The Isle of Man is remarkable chiefly for its stench."
Being well-spoken and well-dressed mattered enormously, even while gossip, scandal, debt and affairs thrived. I say affairs, I mean, well, sexual and business affairs. You'd think that the people wouldn't flock to the coast where a naval invasion force might suddenly land in the midst of them having an ice cream, although obviously ice creams didn't happen for many years after this. But the fact of the matter was that even while France was trying to form a blockade against her, France was no match for the Royal Navy as such at those days. So we were fairly safe and secure, so people could go about their business and have a nice holiday and wear kiss-me-quick hats and or the 18th century equivalent, whatever that was. Meanwhile, the boom in building was continuing. Bathing machines, lodging houses like the elegant terraces like Pelham Crescent were built to rival attractions in Brighton. France wanted to blockade Britain and starve it into submission. He wanted to starve us out. He was particularly unsuccessful with this device. And part of that lack of success is down to the smugglers, because we already had a very strong network of smugglers from the early days of the 18th century who were used to nipping in and out all over the place. So Britain's smuggling community suddenly became a lot more viable and less illegal. In fact, they were pretty much free to do what they wanted as long as they also smuggled some of the goods in and out that were necessary. And to be fair, Napoleon also allowed smuggling because they were desperate for some of the materials in France. They couldn't get a lot of the materials that we had over here, even the tea, the spices, many other goods. You know, they were reliant on England for some of that. So, and they weren't getting enough. And economically speaking, France was in a much worse state than we were. So while they were trying to blockade us, they were the ones who were in a bad way in terms of food, in terms of many other materials. And they were finally defeated in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. And that was really the finish of it. And that was because the smugglers helped England in this matter. and were quite important and integral to the whole getting around the blockade business. After the Napoleonic Wars, in front of what is now called Breed's Place, several privateer cutters were laid up. This was around 1816. Privateering had been a popular pursuit of the seafaring portion of the townspeople, for though attended with much and perhaps more risk than smuggling, every privateer carried guns. It was a pursuit that paid very well. 9 gunboats hailed from Hastings when the war was at its height, each mounting 2 18-pounders, and there were 11 fishing boats who didn't want to be left out, and they were all armed with 2 12-pounder cannonade.
There may be trouble ahead, but what is moonlight and music and love and romance? Let's face the music and dance.
From 1816 to 1831, the Coast Guard, including the blockade, made sure that smuggling was a very difficult, hazardous thing to do. And local smugglers certainly started carrying more weaponry around them. They probably had a cudgel or a club or certainly a knife, which most of the men would have had anyway, fishermen. But it does seem that the violence got worse and worse between them and the blockade, and the blockade didn't care. And the blockade, the men in the blockade probably took a lot of the goods and drank them themselves or sold them on. I don't think we're talking about men of great honour here. So a difficult period for all, I think. But other punishments would include transportation to America rather than Australia in those days. I don't know, that was probably considered better or worse, really. In 1 year, between October 1823 and October 1824, the blockade seized 18,000 gallons of spirits, roughly equal gin and brandy, 1,800 yards of silk, 600 bandana handkerchiefs, God knows why, perhaps they were training pirates, 590 pounds of tobacco and about 1,200 pounds of tea, which was still popular at that time. Smuggling went on in this country for something like 150 years, including the Georgian period, because it carried on bit by bit into the 1860s. The end of smuggling came with the reduction of taxes in just about everything that was smuggled. So it was the lack of profit that killed it rather than any military action. But I'm still left querying the why. The why didn't England do more to stop smuggling? I mean, a country that had the best naval power in the world, that had an empire full of countries that they kept in order, more or less, for some years. Why couldn't they have put down the smuggling? I mean, we're talking, even though the smugglers were quite strong in their areas, they could have put the army on it and dealt with it properly and put it out of action at any point in that 150 years. Why didn't they do that? Because in the 1750s, say, the income for the British government was 8 to 10 million. And smuggling, as a conservative estimate, was reckoned to be somewhere between 2 and 3 million in those days. And most of that was the profit, because the goods cost so little, there was an enormous profit to be made. The only explanation to me is that too many people in power and high-ranking businessmen and the high-ranking aristocracy were making a lot of money out of smuggling, and therefore they didn't want it to stop. There's no other explanation that makes any sense, really, unless it was the government that wanted smuggling to carry on, but that makes even less sense somehow, at least to me. I mean, we've all got our own theories, but that's a big question for me. 150 years, finally stopped, very easily and quickly, by reducing taxes. They could have done that as well, certainly on some of the goods. But they didn't. So we're left with a little bit of a mystery, because we don't know the actual honest answer to why the British government put an end to smuggling pretty much straight away. What happened after the smuggling finished? I mean, by the 1850s, the smuggling was over, so there was not much happening. How did people earn a living? Well, things were a bit bleak for a while. In the 1850s, you had the Corn Law, food prices were rising, and it was a difficult time. In Hastings, however, there was a little brightness, because Hastings was still discovering itself as a holiday resort. So more and more people were visiting, and from the 1840s onwards there was a train service to Hastings and the roads were improved. So that made it a lot easier for people to get down here. And they did. So the fishermen and their families, they started to have stalls selling whelks and oysters and cockles. There were flower sellers, and there were boat trips for the rich. So visitors go to see the fishermen, and that would have really amused and entertained them a lot. And then they could wander around the old town. Who knows what's around the corner for Hastings in terms of its future? One thing's for sure though, unless taxes go up, it won't be smuggling. Although I suspect there might be people still, should we say, enjoying a little bit of smuggling, but it's more likely to be tobacco. Yeah, even today tobacco smuggling goes on, and the government does lose a couple of billion through tax loss. I think the best thing you can say about smuggling, it wasn't all bad. It did provide extra money for poor families. And yes, some people were treated very badly. But overall, I think, as far as certainly as the poor and needy were concerned, it was a good thing while it lasted.
That shouldn't have been. I heard the thunder